Welcome to 10-Minute Tuesdays. I'm Dr. Kerry-Ann Williams. And Black Mental Health Matters is a podcast about everything related to mental wellness in the Black community and beyond. Have you experienced traumatic stress? All of us go through unexpected experiences in life, and we all have a variety of responses to the things that happen to us. How do we know if our experiences have left a traumatic imprint? And what exactly is trauma? That's what I'm going to talk about in this week's 10-Minute Tuesday. Let's get into it. Trauma can be difficult to define because it is relative. But generally, trauma happens when our experiences overwhelm our psychological and, I would venture to say, physical capacity to cope. It doesn't mean that you didn't eventually figure out a way to cope, but that for a period of time, your ability to cope was quite compromised. I say psychological capacity to cope because our psychology involves multiple aspects of the self, our emotional capacity, our cognitive/thoughts/reasoning capacity, our behavioral responses, our resilience. And I say physical capacity because traumatic stress affects us physically. It affects our sleep and our appetite. Trauma can lead to physical pain in our bodies, abdominal pain, back pain, headaches. It can cause fatigue. And anything unexpected and overwhelming can be traumatic. So I want to say a word about this because traditionally, people have tried to box trauma into specific categories: physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse. Yes, but here are some other things that can be traumatic. Grief. The loss of a person in your life can be so overwhelming that it becomes a traumatic loss. Loss can be a death, but it can also be the loss of a relationship. It can be the loss of a job, moving to a new place, immigrating to a new country. Even if it is voluntary, can be traumatic. You can find yourself psychologically overwhelmed. Is there anything that happened in your life that caused you to feel psychologically overwhelmed, that you found difficult to cope with, that left an imprint on your life? Recognizing that what you have experienced could be traumatic is the first step, because knowing is the first step to doing or taking action. What are some specific signs of trauma or traumatic stress? Well, I think anytime you hear a talk about trauma, you'll hear folks talk about the body's survival response, that biologically, we are designed for self-protection. So when the body feels threatened, you can have certain potential innate responses. You may respond with aggression or fighting back. That's a fight response. In this situation, trauma or threat can lead to something that mental health specialists call hyperarousal, where you become emotionally more intense. After the traumatic experience, you can become more irritable and more reactive. But some people have what's called a flight response. So when the human body feels threatened, you may automatically respond by running away from the threat. So instead of going towards the threat in a fight response, you go away from the threat in a flight response. This tendency can lead to withdrawal, isolation, or avoidance after a trauma. This is what mental health specialists call hypoarousal. Sometimes it looks like depression. Thirdly, sometimes when the human body is threatened, it freezes up. You see this sometimes in nature films where some wild animals freeze up when under threat from a predator. Well, sometimes after a trauma, a person can experience moments where they psychologically shut down and disengage from the world. They experience something called dissociation, which I won't have enough time to discuss on a 10-Minute Tuesday, but it is a psychological phenomenon where a person can mentally retreat to a different place, a different time, and in more extreme cases, a different persona, disengaging from the present moment. It is something the mind can do as a form of self-protection when under a traumatic threat, and it can continue happening periodically, even after the traumatic event or events have passed. Now, there is one more thing that we sometimes see in the trauma world, particularly when there is trauma in relationships, what we call relational trauma, and particularly when you can't easily escape the situation. This particular trauma response is called the fawn response. This is where the person gets closer to the source of the trauma and tries to leverage the relationship to try to reduce the frequency and intensity of the abuse. When you fawn, you try to get closer to the source of the relational trauma, to try to give the person or persons what they want, to try to avoid the abuse. So this is a classic fight, flight, freeze, and fawn response, but these are quite general. What else can we point to as signs of traumatic stress? Changes in your baseline mood after the traumatic event. Are you now more depressed or more irritable than you used to be? Do you now have mood swings that can happen without warning and take a lot of energy to regulate? Disrupted sleep. It's difficult to rest easy when your body's survival network has been disrupted by a traumatic event. Effects on sleep can last for years. You may even experience nightmares. Moments in time where you suddenly re-experience the intense emotions and mental images that you had during the trauma. This is called a flashback, and you will most likely need a professional to help you if you experience this on a regular basis. Triggers. These are reminders of the traumatic event that cause an intense psychological or emotional reaction. And these reminders can come in through any of your senses. It can be a place that you see, a visual reminder. It can be a song or sound that you hear, an audible reminder. It can be a perfume or scent that reminds you of a person or a time. You can be triggered by touch. Any of these things can cause a strong emotional response that is difficult to cope with and can make you feel self-conscious. Anxiety. Many people describe being more anxious than they used to be after a traumatic event. They can be more sensitive, jumpy, and may have anxiety attacks where their heart races and they feel overcome by physical symptoms of anxiety. And guys, I haven't even begun to talk about how children express trauma, and we're almost out of time. But children can start avoiding school, getting sick more often, and they may start having issues with bedwetting, and some teenagers can get into substance abuse. Now, as we wrap up, I want to mention that there are some disparities in the diagnosis of trauma in the Black community. So imagine, as a Black person, if your particular response to trauma is to have more intense emotions, to have a fight response or a flight response when under threat. Now imagine if flashing police lights are a traumatic trigger for you, and you respond with either a fight response or a flight response. How will other people respond to your symptoms of trauma? Food for thought. And that's it for today. This is definitely not a comprehensive lesson in trauma. I would not be able to do that in 10 minutes. If you're experiencing signs and symptoms of trauma that are difficult to manage alone, please see a mental health professional that specializes in the treatment of trauma. Thanks for joining me today for this 10-minute Tuesday. Let me know if there's anything I touched on today that you would like for me to speak more about. You've been listening to Black Mental Health Matters with Dr. Kerry-Ann. Take care and have a great week.